Hello everyone and welcome back to Tech with NK. In today's video, I'm going to propose a detailed solution to the exercise cookie jar from CS50's Introduction to Programming with Python. I'm going to show you one way you can do this, and my aim is just to give you a few hints or ideas that you could use when solving the exercise later on by yourself. So stay tuned to the end of the video so you won't miss any explanations. That said, let's look at the exercise and see what's expected from us. So if I scroll through this and come to about this point, it says, suppose you like to implement a cookie jar in which to store cookies. So in the file called jar.py, implement a class called jar with these methods. Underscore underscore init underscore underscore should initialize a cookie jar with a given capacity which represents the maximum number of cookies that can fit in the cookie jar. And if capacity is not a non-negative int, then underscore underscore init underscore underscore should instead raise a value error. Also, we need to initialize the method underscore underscore stir underscore underscore, which should return a stir with n cookies, where n is the number of cookies in the cookie jar. For instance, if there are 3 cookies in the cookie jar, then stir should return 1, 2, 3 emojis of a cookie. And next we have deposit, which should add n cookies to the cookie jar. And if adding that many will exceed the cookie jar's capacity, deposit should instead raise a value error. And likewise, we have another function called withdraw, which should remove n cookies from the cookie jar. And if there aren't that many cookies in the cookie jar, then withdraw should instead raise a value error. And the last 2 functions, we have capacity, which should return the cookie jar's capacity, and size, which should return the number of cookies actually in the cookie jar, which initially should be 0. And we are told to structure our code per the below, where we have our class jar and we have the different functions or methods: init, stir, deposit, withdraw, capacity, and size. And looking at this property decorator here, we see that the functions capacity and size are getter methods. But this is not the end of the exercise, because after implementing jar.py, we are also called to implement test underscore jar.py with 4 or more functions that collectively test our implementation of jar, whose name should begin with test underscore so that we can test it with pytest of test underscore jar.py. And if we keep scrolling down, we have a lot of explanation that have been given to us here, but I'm going to skip this for now, and we're going to look at this hint. And this hint pretty much shows us what our file test underscore jar should look like. We're going to import the class jar from the file jar. Then we're going to create the functions test underscore init, test underscore stir, test underscore deposit, and test underscore withdraw, because these are the main functions that need testing. And pretty much what all of this explanation up here is trying to tell us is that, let's say you want to test one of these functions, for example, test underscore stir. And the thing with some of these instance methods is that you can't test them alone, like individually. You need to call some other methods before being able to test your intended method. Like for example, with the method underscore underscore stir underscore underscore, we have the function test underscore stir. And the first thing we need to do is to create the object jar. And the first check that we can carry out is to ensure that when the jar is created, it's actually empty, there are no cookies in it. But then, this won't suffice for a test for the method underscore underscore stir. So we need to call the method deposit so that we actually have cookies in this jar, and use now the method stir to display the number of cookies found in this jar. And so this is what our file test underscore jar should look like. And if you keep scrolling down, we have a demo here that does not really tell us a lot, but we're just going to skip it. And as usual, we need to create a folder, we call it jar, seed into that directory, in which we create our files jar.py and test underscore jar.py. And at the end of the code, test our code ourselves before submitting it with submit 50. So that said, I think the exercise is clear enough, and we can go on to VS Code and start coding. And this is what our file jar.py should look like. We have our class and the different functions: init, stir, deposit, withdraw, capacity, and size. I've just added a few doc strings to these methods to help guide us while we implement them one after the other. So we're going to start with the method underscore underscore init. We know that in this method we need to initialize the capacity and the size, and also this capacity should not be less than 0. So we can carry out a check for that. In this first case, the default capacity will be 12. But if the user chooses to modify this value, we want to ensure that if capacity is less than 0, then we want to raise a value error. But if that's not the case and capacity is a positive value, then we want to create two instance variable we'll call self underscore capacity, and we're going to set this value to the capacity the user is going to enter, and the second instance variable will be self dot underscore size for the size of a cookie jar, and initially this size should be 0. And note that we're using underscore capacity and underscore size here to refer to the instance variables because we have defined these getter functions here, capacity and size. And so we can't just go ahead and say self.capacity, self.size and assign them values, because that would make Python to think that we're trying to call the setter functions in the class jar, of which we do not have any setter functions here. So to avoid the confusion, we need to add the underscore here for the instance variable. So we have self.underscore capacity and self.underscore size. And that's it for the function underscore underscore init. Next function will be underscore underscore stir. And all that this function does is to return the number of cookies as an emoji. So all we need to do is to return self.underscore size star this cookie jar emoji. So I'm just going to copy this and I'm going to paste it right about here, and I'm going to put this in quotes because it's supposed to be a string. And this is all we need to do in the function underscore underscore stir, because remember that string multiplication does not work like actual multiplication. So if you multiply an integer with a string, what we have will be repetitions of that string. And so if the cookie jar is, let's say, 3 cookies, we're going to have 3 star this cookie jar emoji, which is a stir, and it's just going to repeat the stir 3 times. So we'll have 1, 2, 3 cookies. And now let's move to our function deposit. And in this function, we want to add n cookies to the jar or raise a value error if capacity is exceeded. So the user is going to call this function and pass a parameter to it. And we need to use that parameter to modify the size of the cookie jar and ensure that this size does not exceed the capacity of the cookie jar. So we want to carry out a check first. And in this check, we want to ensure that if n plus self.underscore size is greater than the capacity of a cookie jar, which should be self.underscore capacity, then we want to raise a value error. But if that's not the case, then we want to increase the value of self.underscore size by the user's input, which should be self plus equals to n. Self.size plus equals to n. And this should do for our function deposit. The next function will be our function withdraw. And in this function, we're trying to withdraw n cookies from the jar or raise a value error if the size is exceeded. That is, we can logically remove more cookies than they are actually present in the cookie jar. So we need to carry out a check first. We want to ensure that n is not greater than self.underscore size. Because if that's the case, we're trying to remove more than we have, and so we need to raise a value error. But if the user's input is not greater than the number of cookies that are present in the jar, then we can carry out our withdrawal, which will be self.underscore size minus equal to n. And this should do for the function withdraw. Next, we need to implement the function capacity, which is very easy. All we need to do is to return self.underscore capacity. And last but not the least, we need to implement the function size, which is as easy as the previous one. We're going to return self.underscore size. And that's it for our file jar.py. And all we need to do now is just to save this file and implement test_jar.py, because the aim of this exercise is being able to write tests to test these functions. We've not been asked to write a main function to implement our class jar. They said we could, but we are not composed to do so. So I'm just going to leave that out for now. Probably you could do it by yourself later on if you want to, but I'm just going to move to our file test underscore jar.py, and we're going to implement the functions in this file. And looking at the file test underscore jar.py, there are two things we need to import. First, the class jar from the file jar.py, and next pytest, because we need to use that to carry out our test. And I took this implementation from the hints that were given to us online, and as we can see, the function test underscore stir was already implemented for us. So what we need to do is to implement, let's start with this one, test underscore init. And in this function, there are two things we want to check. The first is that the init function assigns a capacity when the user creates an instance of our class jar, and also it raises a value error if needed. So we want to make sure that our function underscore init can carry out those two functionalities. So to do this, I'm going to create a first instance of this class. I'm going to call this jar1, and I'll call the class jar. And we know that each time that we call the class jar, the function init is called, and by default it has a capacity of 12. So now we can already test that. So we want to assert that jar1.capacity will be equal to 12. And also with pytest.raises of value error, we want to ensure that creating an instance of this class jar with a negative input for the capacity is going to raise a value error. So now we can create a second instance. Let's call this one jar2, and want to call the class jar, and want to modify the capacity and set it to be equal to, let's say what, -2. We should raise a value error. And that's it for the function test underscore init. Our function test underscore stir has already been implemented for us, so we're just going to move to the function test underscore deposit. And in this function, we want to check that the deposit function modifies the jar size and also raises an error if needed. And as usual, the first thing we need to do is to create an instance of this class. So I'm going to create one right now. And let's say we specify the capacity that we want. Let's set it to, for example, 10. So we have our instance jar with a capacity of 10. The first thing we're going to do is to test the function deposit to see if we can deposit a value less than 10. So let's say we deposit 5 cookies. And this therefore means that the number of cookies present in the cookie jar should no longer be 0, but it should be 5. And we can check that using jar.size. This will look like assert that jar.size will be equal to 5, which we know should work because the capacity of our jar is actually 10. So now what we're going to do is we're going to try to deposit more cookies into this cookie jar. But this time around, we're going to deposit a number of cookies that is going to exceed our capacity so that we can trigger the value error. So let's say with pytest.raises in parentheses of value error, we want to deposit, so I'm going to call jar.deposit how many cookies. Let's say we try to deposit 8 more cookies, which should result to 13, and we know that that is going to exceed our capacity and so raise a value error. And last but not the least, we're going to implement test underscore withdraw. And in this function, we want to check that the withdraw function modifies the jar size and also raises an error if needed. And we're going to proceed just like we just did with test underscore deposit. First of all, we're going to create an instance of this class. We're going to call this jar, and we're going to give it a certain capacity. We're not going to use the default value. Let's say we go with 10 again. Next, I'm going to call the function deposit because it's actually impossible to withdraw without depositing, right? So let's say we deposit how many? For example, let's say we deposit 8 cookies. And now we can call the function withdraw. So I want to jar.withdraw, withdraw. Let's say how many cookies? Let's say 5 cookies. And to check that this works, we want to assert that jar.size now will be equal to no longer 8 but 3. And to ensure that the function withdraw raises a value error, let's try to withdraw a number of cookies greater than the actual number of cookies actually present, which we know right now is 3. So let's say with pytest.raises in parentheses of value error, what do we want to check? That jar.withdraw, so withdraw, or for example, let's say we want to take out 5 again, is going to raise a value error. We should, because the present number of cookies is 3. It's no longer 8. So if I save this, I open up my terminal, I have to start by seeding to the right directory. So I'm going to seed it to jar. And in this directory, we're going to run pytest of test underscore jar.py. And we have 4 test pass in 0.01 seconds. And with this, we are sure that our file jar.py and test underscore jar.py are working correctly. But then this could change very rapidly. For example, if we come back to our file jar.py and let's say in our functions deposit and withdraw, instead of a minus, let me interchange this here and I've added a minus instead of a plus, and interchange this 1 2 instead of minus, I put a plus, or save this. Then I'm going to run pytest of test underscore jar.py and we have 3 failed and only 1 passed. And it tells us that the functions test underscore stir, test underscore deposit, and test underscore withdraw all failed. And as we've seen before, we could actually scroll through pytest here to see where it went wrong and understand how to fix this. But we already know the fix for this, which is quite easy. All we need to do is come back here and put back our plus sign, and come back here and put back our minus sign. We'll save this, and if I run this one more time, I press enter, we are back in business. Everything seems to work correctly. So I want to believe this is good enough for this exercise and the code was clear enough. However, if you do have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comment section below and I'll be more than pleased to answer you. If you did enjoy the video, do well to hit the like and subscribe buttons, and I look forward to seeing you in my upcoming contents. That said, have a good day.